In this tutorial, I'm going to take you through the process of setting up a network in the Unity game engine and having a custom UI for that network that allows you to select different network players. So I'm going to start with a brand new Unity project. And the first thing we're going to do is set up a UI that will allow us to interact with our network manager. So the network manager in Unity requires two scenes, an offline scene and an online scene. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up those two scenes. This scene will be our offline scene. So the first thing I'll do is create an empty game object to just hold our network manager through each scene. The network manager is a singleton once it's created, and so it'll persist between scenes. So to add a network manager, which is really going to be the backbone of our process here of setting up a custom network UI, we just add the component network manager. A couple of things to notice about this. First of all, it's a component, so it's just a script that's attached to a game object. As a script, we can access any of these public variables, including the scene that will load our network in, the online scene, the scene that will bounce back to when we disconnect from our network, the offline scene, and the network address for whatever IP we decide to connect to. This could be a dedicated server we set up, or we just have Unity running, or it could be dynamically generated. For now, we'll keep it as localhost, which is just going to be the IP of the computer that I'm currently using. The network port will also give the ability through our custom UI to set, because you might want that set to something specific. Again, if you had a dedicated server, you might want one and only one port open to traffic for your network. Okay. Finally, in spawn info, the player prefab is a very important part of the network manager. This will be what we change when we're selecting players, and it determines the type of player that will be entering the network. Alright, so let's start making a custom UI. So first, let's have a button, and I'm just going to look at that button in my scene, and I can see it's far too low, so I will pull it up. Let me make these windows a little clearer. Alright, so we need a button for starting a host server, and a button for joining as a client. So I'll duplicate that. We'll call this button start host, and this button join client. Okay, and we'll pull start host up a bit. Let's give these, you know what, let's pull them over too, so they're nice and centered. Let's give the text a little more information here. So we'll call this start host server, and this join Alright, and we'll save this scene as our network lobby. Okay, so we have a network lobby. We want that to be the first scene in our build settings, because the network manager In order to register this as our offline scene, you'll see it's going to look in the build settings of your project. So we need to add this scene to our build settings. So we'll add open scenes, network lobby, and now we can drag it to our offline scene. All right, we need an online scene now. So I'm going to create a new scene. I want this to be a scene that we can interact with players. So I'm going to create a plane and put it at the 0 transform and set it to something like 10 by 10 on the X and Z axis, so you can see nice long plane. And then I'll save this scene as our network scene. Let's save it. And then I will add this to our build settings as well. And it's very important here, the order that you load your network lobby first, because the network lobby is going to do things like set up the player that you'll then enter the network with, set the IP address of the server that you're going to interact with, and set the port. So we always want to load the network lobby first, and the way we ensure that is we just make sure that it's first in our build settings like that. Okay, that's all we need to get started. So let's switch back to our network lobby. Oh, in our network scene we will need a button as well. So UI button, and let's bring this one kind of up and over. And we will call this our button disconnect. So we'll have a button to disconnect from the server, or disconnect as the server if we happen to be the server itself. And we'll just call this disconnect. All right. So let me save that, switch back to my network lobby. And I don't really like the look of these buttons, so let's customize them real quick. This is a custom network menu after all. So I'm going to open up Adobe Illustrator. You could use any kind of image editing tool like GIMP or anything you wanted. I'm just going to use this. I'll create new default settings, and let's just make a cool looking button. So probably about that big. And let's give it a neat color. Maybe something, kind of a fan of the light blue. And some effects. Let's see. We could give it like a neon glow, I suppose. That's good. Kind of like that. And let's roughen up the edges. Let me get this cool kind of image. Now I will export that. As a PNG. And then in my documents here, I'm just going to pull it into my Unity project. Show you what I'm doing here. Blue button. Just pull it into assets. Now I need to set that texture type to sprite 2D and UI and apply. And then in our buttons, for our target graphic. We can just drag, oh, not our target, our UI. Our source image, we can just drag that over. And for the font size, first of all, let's make that button a bit bigger. So we're at 160/30, how about 180/50? That looks all right. Let's set the alpha a little bit faded, like that. Let's change the font type, color to white. No, black was actually better. I like that kind of blue on blue, maybe a purple. There we go. All right, and we have a custom button just like that. All right, so I can actually just grab these component values, copy component, and I really should have done this before I duplicated the button, but that's okay. I can paste component values here. Oh, I need to grab the image values. All right, copy component values, paste component values here. There we go. Let's grab the rect transform values and paste those. Oops, rect transform values of this. Well, it's just 180/50, right? 180/50. And then to get the color just right, we will copy those values as well. There we go. Cool. Okay. And then let's go ahead. I'm just going to copy this whole button and switch to my network scene. And instead of, I'll paste the button in there. Oops, not an event system. There we go. And just pull it up here and over. Oh, let's put it on the right side. And I'll just call this button, just to save some time, button disconnect, and then just delete this. We don't really need that. All right, so now we have our custom buttons. Let me set the text to disconnect. The other thing I want to do, save that, switch to my network lobby. And we're just setting up the UI elements here. We're not doing anything with network code yet. The other thing I want to do here is let's add a panel so we can switch this menu on and off if we want. And panels just kind of look cool. All right. So the panel is just a game object that we will nest these in. And the panels, we could make a custom background for this as well if we wanted. So let's just make, there's our panel. Looks good. Let's give it some other effects. Well, let's give it a fill of like keeping with our theme. And for effects, we could do let's Do a radio blur. Nope, don't like that. Let's do a glowing edges. Sounds kind of cool. Nope, don't like that either. How about wave? Didn't really do much. Round corners. And how about neon glow? That's kind of nice. All right, let's use that. And then let's export it as our panel. Purple panel.png. Now that it's all exported, we can pull up Unity, pull it in to our assets. There's our purple panel. Let's turn it into a sprite. Apply. There we go. And for our panel, now we can just pull that into our source image. That looks okay. I'm gonna pull the alpha on that down even more, so it's just really faint. And I don't really like the color anymore, so just to show you how you can change the colors right here. I like that kind of better, glowing. All right. And actually, on the buttons, I think it's going to look a little better if we pull the alpha down. Yeah, that looks much better. All right. And I'll do the same for here. Oops, it's the same one. I'll do the same for here. So just pull it down to about there. All right. So that looks nice. Now, two more things we're going to need. We'll need a UI input field, and again we can pull that image over. Let's pull this up and let's make this 80 by 50. And for the text, actually, I think for the input field, I would rather have not the panel. I would rather have the panel that we just made as our input field. And I want to change the color of it here. So let's make it, I don't know, like a dark blue. All right. 50 is probably a bit much for this. We just need an IP, so like 40 by 120, maybe even 30. All right, let's drag it over. So that's going to be our, well, let's center it, IP address. And for the placeholder text, put IP address so we can see it. Let's make it white-ish. And we can pull the alpha all the way up. There we go. How about just IP address? So we don't have to mess with the settings too much here. Ooh. Okay, let's pull that whole thing over here and maybe down a bit. And then let's duplicate this and pull it over. But this one can be pretty short. Input field port, input field IP, we'll just name those. The text box, let's call text IP and text, because we're going to want a link to these in code. So I'm just going ahead and naming them now. For the placeholder, we'll just say port. And then, as I said, this doesn't have to be as big, so we'll make the width like 60. And drag it over a little bit more. There we go. Great. All right. So that looks good to me. Perhaps the color scheme could be improved. You can, yeah, see how to do that on your own now, though, which is kind of the point of these tutorials. So you're not limited to exactly how I do it. You know how to quickly export an image and get it in here as a UI and change the menu setup. One thing to notice is the panel itself we can shut on and off with code. So if we need it to persist, we can just regenerate it. So let's call this panel network menu. So it has a name we can talk to in code. And that is it for the UI elements. Let me save this, switch back to the network scene. That's fine. I just want to disconnect there. Once again, I decided I liked the alpha a little bit higher on this, so I'll set that there. Okay, and we'll save. So we just have one button here to disconnect, otherwise you'll be rolling around in the network. And over in our oh, we need one last thing over in our network lobby. We need a drop down for player select. So let's create UI drop down, and for this, you know what, we can just go ahead and use this is our target image again, and let's pull it up here, and the template, I believe, no, arrow, oh yeah, actually we do want the arrow in a bit, and the label we want over here. The drop down itself we can say 180, well actually 160 is probably good, by 40, 50. All right, and then we'll save that. Drop downs have these cool value settings, so it'll return a value which is the index depending on what's selected, and we can just set them here. So we'll call this player 1 for now, player 2, and player 3, and notice that you can set a sprite here as well. I'm not going to, but okay, so now we have a player select. Let's test out all our UI elements, make sure everything's working, so we can drop down. Okay, we can enter things in the port. All right, so the entry text we probably need to change there. We can start server, and join as client does not seem to be clicking. We only have start server, so let's see what's going on with that. In fact, let's pull this into our panel as well. So join as client should be clickable. When I click on it, it clicks on the server. Maybe that's a product of me duplicating here the button script. Alright, so I'm actually just going to remove that and duplicate this again. Pull it up, pull it down. Not sure what was going on there, but we'll call this button join client. And for the text, we'll say join as client. And we'll pull that text down a bit. Alright, let's try that again. Now we have everything's clickable. All right, great. Okay. So that is all of our UI elements that we need to set up. So we've done that. Let's add our networking elements. All right. So on the network manager itself, because I know that this network manager is going to persist between scenes. First of all, let's add our online scene, which is our network here. The network manager will put a new script, which we'll call custom network menu. Add networking elements. Whoa, what's wrong with my spelling? Add networking elements. All right, so we have a custom network menu. Let's edit that script so that we can actually join the network. So this is going to be using a lot of stuff from Unity, so we need to use unityengine.networking. And we'll need a, let's see, we'll need a link to our IP text, so we probably want using Unity Engine. We'll want the namespace UI as well in here, so I can access text boxes publicly if I want to. And we'll have one for our port. Let's then just start our server off here. So first of all, we can make a method called start server. And in that, we'll just call, because it's a singleton, our network manager singleton that we've spawned, and start host. So that's how we'll start a server. Okay. For our player select, what we'll do is, I think actually we don't. We may need that, but we don't actually need public variables linking our IP address and port. When we start, we can go ahead and get the array of players. Well, actually, that's what we should have up here, is a public game object array, which we'll call player prefabs. For the dropdown, we will link a method called select player, and we'll take in an int, and we will just say if we have player prefabs, if it does not equal null, and there's a player prefab at the index I, then we'll set the player using our network manager. Player prefab equals to whatever the dropdown returns as its value. All right, and we'll link that up in code. So let's have a method for setting up our menu. The reason for doing this in code is we want to be able to have links to this menu persist between scenes. So if we connect to the network and then disconnect, we want this menu to still exist in the same way. So we'll do game object dot find and button start host, I think we called it, right? So we'll just search for these three elements. So we have, let's call this dropdown, player select, and then we have button start host, button join client, input field. Okay, button start host, button join client. Button start host dot get component. Grab the button component and add a onClick dot remove all listeners first, and then we'll add a listener. Add listener, and the listener will send a delegate method to it, right? An event that will then call this method start server. Okay. All right. So that's how we'll grab a link to the button start host, and then game object. We need a link to our dropdown. So dropdown player select, that's what we called it. Get components, dropdown, onClick. Oh, because it's a drop-down, we want on value changed. Let's remove all listeners, and then, instead of typing all that again, let's add a listener, which then calls select player. Oops, select player. And the cool thing about this is that it'll pass on its value change to select player, so that we'll have a listener on the dropdown, which we set up in code. We haven't actually set up the menu yet, but we have a function that'll do that at least. And then when we select player, because the dropdown passes on a value anyway of its index, we'll just take that value in and we'll set our player prefabs to it. So we gotta make sure we fill this player prefabs when we return to the editor. All right, and the other thing to do is we should keep track of our so I'm not going to do anything in start, but we'll have a void on enable, and let's use Unity's scene management. So we need to know if we've reloaded the scene or if we're in the if we've loaded the online scene. So to determine that, we'll add a scene manager, scene loaded. We'll add a delegate method here on scene loaded, and then define it. We don't need an update here. On scene loaded, and we'll take in scene object, and load scene mode object. So this will be our delegate method that gets called whenever this is enabled. Whenever a scene is loaded, we will say if our scene name equals network lobby. So if we've bounced out to the network lobby or we're just starting the network lobby, then we will set up menu. Else, we might want a separate function. For now, we can call debug log setup, or let's log a to-do, implement setup disconnect. We'll just do that for now, because I want to get to testing before I write too much code. Alright, so we'll set up the menu. We will grab references to everything. Cool. Alright. So we have a player in our network manager now. We have a player prefabs array. So let's make some players. So to do that, I'm going to import the characters package for Unity, because I don't feel like coding a first-person character myself. We don't really need all of this. So let's get rid of rollerball. We don't need third-person character. We'll keep cross-platform input, sprites, and utility. Okay, there we go. So now in our cross-platform, let's show you where I'm going here. So in standard assets that we just imported in first-person character prefabs, we'll just grab a first-person controller and drag it into the scene. It's not doing much there. So I'm going to rename this as player 1. And the thing about first-person character controllers is they don't actually have a visual appearance. They're just a rigid body and audio and a first-person controller that calls their character controller and a camera. So first of all, I'll take, do we have a listener here? I believe we do. We have an audio listener, so I'm going to take that off because we might have more than one of the, well, we will have more than one of these in the scene. Camera's fine. That should find, the script should find the local player network that is joining as a client. So, all right, so in first person character, we need a couple things. We'll first of all need something to see it. So let's add a 3D object. Let's just add a cube. We can even call this cube player. Yeah. And the cube we can move up to 1, so it's kind of like a floating cube on the y-axis. It's a networked player, so we're going to have to add a network identity. It's going to have local player authority because it's moving around as the player joining the network. We need a network transform so that we can sync its movements across the network, and I'm going to sync the transform not rigid body 3D. These values, like the network send rate, the movement threshold and snap threshold, and interpolation, are worth tinkering with to get nice smooth movements over a network when you're looking at another player and their movements. But let's leave it at the default values for now. Alright, so as a network identity, a network transform, we need to add a setup script. And it's important to add this setup script at this level with the network identity and network transform. And the reason is we don't want the network set up so that one player, when they move forward, moves all players forward. So we need a way of shutting off the movement based on input for other players. So we're going to do that, shutting off the movement for other players through our setup local player script. Alright, so here's our script. This needs to be using Unity engine.networking, and we want network behavior. Alright, and the only thing we're really going to do is in start, we'll say if we're not local player, then we need to shut off our components. So we'll get components. So how are we moving around here? We're moving around through Unity standard assets dot characters, the namespace Unity standard assets characters, first person controller is the actual script in that namespace that moves us around, and we'll set enabled to false. So if we're not the local player, we don't want to be moving things around. We can also go ahead and get the component character controller and set that to false as well. Finally, just to be safe, we can get component in children. We can grab the camera. I shouldn't really need to do this because the network is smart enough to know which camera is the local player, but if we're not the local player, we don't want to be confusing our game engine with too many enabled cameras. Alright, so that's all we'll do for now. We don't need an update here. If we're not the local player, we're going to shut some things off. Okay, switching back to Unity. We have this cube player. Let's go ahead and make it a prefab and delete it from our scene. So there's our cube player. Actually, let's bring it back in and let's make a different player called sphere player. And you guessed it, sphere player is not going to have a cube. We'll break the prefab instance. Let's create a 3D object, sphere, drag it up to 1. Other than that, everything's the same. We have our setup local player script on there, network transform, network identity. And let's drag sphere player over to assets. Finally, let's delete that sphere, and let's make another one, another player called cylinder player. And we'll give her, I don't know, they don't really have genders, a cylinder for their visual appearance, and set it to 1 again, and everything else is the same. We'll drag that over to assets. Alright, so now we have 3 players, and in our network manager game object, not the network manager script, but the network manager game object, we can populate this player prefab array with our 3 players. So network manager, first one's going to be cube, the second one's going to be sphere, the third one's going to be cylinder. Now in our dropdown, we can actually modify these names to cube player, sphere player, and cylinder player. Alright. So those are all set up now. And right, let's see, is there anything else we need to do? I don't think so. So our network manager right now has no player prefab. Let's see if it freaks out when we just start up the lobby scene. It does not. Great. Okay. So let's, just to be safe, give it a default prefab of cube player. And I will go ahead and make this visible. Alright, so we're set on cube player. Let's take a look at our network manager, which, as you can see, is a don't destroy unload game object, so we'll be persisting between scenes as well as being a singleton. Right now, it has cube player as its player prefab. If we select sphere player, it changes that. So now if we start our host server, first of all, we have a nice working character controller, which is pretty cool. And we can take a look at our network scene. You'll see that our sphere object here is in fact the thing moving around. All right. Awesome. Okay, so we can now join as a variety of players. Next, let's test. So to test this, we need another instance of this, and we need the ability to join as a client. But we have currently set up all our networking elements that we'll need. Alright, and we created network players. So let's finish coding the custom network menu. We need to be able to disconnect, we need to be able to join as a client, and set the IP and port. Alright, so let's add some more references here. We'll want to find the button join client component button. So we'll want references to these. We'll want to remove all listeners, and then I'll just copy and paste this. We'll add a listener, but we want to join client. Alright, so let's write that method. So join client's going to be a little bit different than start server because we want the ability to join a client that has an IP we're setting in the network lobby scene. So first we'll pull the IP address. Let's just do IP. From our input IP, what was it, text IP? Whatever we called this. Text button here, input field, so text IP, and let's pull that up here. Make these in order. Whoops, didn't mean to actually reformat the order. So input field needs to be up there. Alright, so we have text port and text IP is what we're looking for. Those are both just game objects that we can find. Text IP. And let's see, this is a text box. And we can just pull the text like that. And we'll get the same for port. Whoops. Text port. Get component. Text. Ooh, wow. Dot text. Alright. And now let's do some simple checks here. So if IP dot let's see. Dot length. We'll make sure it's greater than 0. Then we will say network manager singleton dot network address. We'll set the network address of the network manager. Again, these are all public variables, so we'll just set it to IP. For the, we'll test again if the port length is greater than 0. So if we don't have an empty string, actually there might be a better way to do this. Dot, that's probably okay. If it's greater than 0, we'll have to parse that into an int. So we do int.try parse port out x variable, and then we'll set the network manager singleton to start port network port to x. So if we can parse a port out of x, we will go ahead and set it. And then after that, so if we don't have a value for these, we'll just skip right onto this. But if we do have a value, we'll try and set the port and the IP to whatever is set by the user. And again, you could just do this in code for a dedicated server if you wanted to just force all clients to connect to one server. You can just hard code that IP. But we're allowing the user to connect to any particular server they want. So then we just start client. And start client's going to use the network port and network address. So that's how we'll join as a client. And we have a reference to our join client in our menu, in our setup menu there. Finally, once we have joined, we'll need a method to set up our disconnect menu, which is really just a button, but you could have other things there. And again, we'll use our game object, find button disconnect, I believe we called it. Get component button remove, unclick, remove all listeners, and then paste that in, and let's add a listener. And this one we'll call stop host and client. So the reason, we'll write a method called stop host and client. There's a reason behind there's a method to the madness here. When a network manager starts in the Unity game engine, starts a host, it actually starts a host and a client in one application. You can see this if we just do network manager singleton start host, and we roll over that. So we have, as you can see, the pop-up server and a client in the same application. So that means that whatever application starts to be our host, it's also a server on its own. It's also a client on its own network, as well as being the host for all other clients on that network. So if we want to disconnect, we have to do two things. We have to network manager singleton stop our client, but there's a chance that we're also the server. So after that, network manager singleton stop host. And then we should bounce back into our network lobby, and once we're in our network lobby, we'll know it and set up our menu. We'll know it because we have a on enable, and we're listening to scenes loaded and setting up the menu when that's enabled. So if we're in our network lobby, we will set up that menu. Otherwise, we will set up our disconnect menu. One last thing I want to check is in our disconnect method here, let's make sure that find button disconnect is in fact what we named that button. So let me save in Unity, switch over to our network scene, take a look at our button disconnect. Awesome. Okay, so that's what will get the listener to disconnect. All right, so now in our network lobby, we should be able to set the IP address to anything we want. Oh, we still need to change that text font color. So let me do that right now. And our text port, let's make that color highly visible. So white. Okay. And we'll do the same for IP text. Wait. Okay. Save. So let's just make sure that we are in fact setting the port when we start client. So we'll get an error for this, but I just want to make sure that our network manager picks up that info for our network address and port when we join as a client. And it did. Cool. And we're getting some errors now because we can't join. However, if we do localhost and port 777, after we start a host server on a different application, we should be able to join. We're still getting an error because there is no host server yet. But let's test out our host server again. All right, and if we disconnect, on the third try, we do in fact disconnect. All right. So let's test now. Let's make sure we can actually get a network running. So I'm going to build and run. Test net. Save. And so we can see it, let's do something quite small and make it windowed and play. Alright, and let me make this a bit smaller as well. And we need to see our game. So I'll just drag game over here, make it bigger, and I'll pull Unity off to the side. Alright, so I'm going to run. Well, I should let you see what I'm doing here. I'm going to run the game here, and I'm going to start a host server. And then I will join as a client, local host, port 7777. Alright, and there is the cube player. I'm moving around, and you can see my network transform rate needs to be adjusted quite a bit because we're not getting great feedback, but the network is working.